A lonely widow helped a stranger in need, never realizing he was a billionaire in disguise. Margaret Walsh hadn't intended to become the kind of person who helped strangers in need, but grief had changed her in ways she never anticipated. 3 years after burying her husband of 42 years, she found herself noticing things she'd once been too busy to see. The elderly man struggling to reach a can on the top shelf at the grocery store, the teenage mother counting pennies at the bus stop, the shadows that lingered in people's eyes when they thought no one was looking, the kind that mirrored her own. She sat now at her kitchen table, steam rising from her tea as the November rain tapped against the window. The two-bedroom bungalow on Maple Street felt cavernous without James. Their children had long since moved away, Michael to Boston, Jennifer to Seattle, and while they called faithfully every Sunday, their voices couldn't fill the silence that stretched between those weekly conversations. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. At 67, she felt both ancient and unformed, as if James had taken some essential part of her identity with him when cancer claimed him. She'd been James's wife for so long that being simply Margaret felt like wearing someone else's clothes. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from James's parents, chimed 4 times. Another day nearly gone, indistinguishable from the one before. Her fingers traced the rim of her teacup as she gazed at the calendar pinned to the corkboard. The community center needed volunteers for the upcoming food drive. Margaret had been considering it for weeks, but something always held her back. The thought of forced small talk, of pitying glances from neighbors who still saw her as poor Margaret Walsh, the widow. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. Jennifer's voice bubbled through the line, detailing her promotion at the tech company and her boyfriend's plans for them to vacation in Hawaii. "That's wonderful, dear," Margaret said, smiling despite the ache in her chest. "I'm so proud of you. Mom, are you getting out at all?" "Mrs. Abernathy told me she hasn't seen you at book club in months." Margaret's smile faded. "I've been busy." The silence that followed contained all of Jennifer's doubt. "Well, promise me you'll do something this week. Anything? Even just a walk in the park." After hanging up, Margaret stood at the window watching raindrops race down the glass. James would be disappointed in her retreat from life. "Live fully, Maggie," he'd whispered in those final days, his hand frail within hers. "Promise me." A promise she had yet to keep. The next morning dawned gray but dry. Margaret awoke with an uncharacteristic restlessness, Jennifer's words echoing in her mind. After a simple breakfast, she found herself pulling on her coat and walking shoes. The park was 3 blocks away, a modest green space with winding paths and a small duck pond. In warmer months, it bustled with families and joggers, but today it was nearly deserted. The air held the sharp edge of approaching winter, leaves crunching beneath her feet as she walked. She had completed 1 loop around the pond when she noticed him, a man sitting on a bench, hunched forward, his face partially obscured by a worn baseball cap. His clothes were clean but shabby, jeans frayed at the cuffs, a navy jacket that had seen better days, scuffed work boots. He was older than she first thought, perhaps in his 50s, with several days' worth of salt and pepper stubble on his jaw. What caught her attention wasn't his appearance, but his hands, large, calloused, and trembling slightly, as they held what appeared to be a letter. Even from several feet away, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he refolded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Margaret would have walked past, should have walked past, but something in his posture reminded her so forcefully of James after his diagnosis that her steps slowed, then stopped. "Excuse me," she heard herself say. "Are you all right?" The man's head jerked up, eyes widening slightly at being addressed. They were startling, a clear, intelligent blue that seemed at odds with his disheveled appearance. "I'm fine," he said, his voice deep and unexpectedly cultured. "Thank you for asking." Margaret nodded, already regretting her intrusion, when she noticed his hand press against his side, his face briefly contorting with pain. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just a disagreement with someone who had stronger opinions than I did." Margaret recognized the deflection. She'd become an expert at such evasions herself. "Have you eaten today?" The question seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. A beat of silence passed between them. "I don't need charity," he said finally, something like pride stiffening his spine. "It's not charity to share a meal with someone," Margaret replied. "It's common decency. And honestly, I could use the company." That last part slipped out unbidden, its naked truth making her cheeks warm. But it worked. After a moment's hesitation, the man nodded. "I'm Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "Margaret Walsh." His handshake was firm despite the earlier trembling. Up close, Margaret noticed other details. A small scar above his right eyebrow, the expensive haircut growing out beneath the cap's disguise, the way his eyes seemed to assess everything with quick intelligence. They walked to a small diner 3 blocks from the park, Daniel maintaining a respectful distance beside her. The waitress seated them in a booth by the window, eyeing Daniel with barely concealed suspicion. Margaret ordered coffee for both of them and the daily special. "So, Daniel," Margaret said when the waitress left, "what brings you to Whispering Pines?" The small town wasn't exactly a destination for travelers. Daniel's fingers fidgeted with the paper napkin. "Looking for something I lost a long time ago." Before she could inquire further, the waitress returned with their coffees. Daniel wrapped his hands around the mug as if absorbing its warmth. "And you?" he asked. "Have you lived here long?" "All my life," Margaret replied. "My husband and I raised our children here." She didn't add that James was gone. Something about saying the words aloud to this stranger felt too vulnerable. As they ate, Daniel with the careful deliberation of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, Margaret found herself sharing small, innocuous details about Whispering Pines. The autumn festival happening that weekend, the history of the old mill that had been converted into apartments, the best place to watch sunsets over the lake. Daniel listened attentively, asking occasional questions that revealed a surprising curiosity about the town. When the check came, he reached for his wallet, a sleek leather billfold that, like his haircut, seemed incongruous with his appearance, but Margaret waved him off. "My invitation, my treat," she said firmly. "Then I'll have to return the favor sometime," he replied, and there was something in his voice, a certainty perhaps, that suggested he meant it. Outside the diner, they paused awkwardly on the sidewalk. Margaret suddenly felt foolish. What had possessed her to invite a complete stranger to lunch? "Thank you," Daniel said quietly. "Not just for the meal, but for seeing me. Most people don't." The simple honesty in his words struck Margaret with unexpected force. How long had it been since someone had truly seen her too? "Will you be all right?" she asked, noticing again how he guarded his left side. "I've endured worse," he said with a wry smile. "Goodbye, Mrs. Walsh." She watched him walk away, his figure gradually disappearing around the corner. Only later, unpacking a small bag of groceries she'd picked up on the way home, did she realize she hadn't asked where he was staying or if he had anywhere to go at all. That night, an unseasonable storm battered Whispering Pines. Margaret lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the eaves, wondering if Daniel had found shelter. The rational part of her brain reminded her that he wasn't her responsibility. The widow who helped a stranger in need had done enough for one day. But another part, the part that had withered after James died, whispered that maybe helping others was exactly what she needed. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind fallen branches and puddles reflecting a clearing sky. Margaret's phone rang as she was clearing breakfast dishes. "Mom?" Michael's voice had the harried quality it always carried these days. "Just checking in. Jennifer mentioned you've been keeping to yourself lately." Margaret sighed. "Your sister worries too much." "We both do. Have you thought about the senior community we talked about? The one in Portland with the art classes you liked?" "I'm not ready to leave this house, Michael." The familiar argument stiffened her voice. After extracting a promise to think about it, Margaret hung up and stared at the silent phone. Her children meant well, but they couldn't understand what it meant to leave the home where every corner held a memory of James. The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Mrs. Abernathy, her neighbor of 30 years, holding a covered dish. "I made too much casserole," the older woman announced, bustling past Margaret into the kitchen. "Walter can't eat leftovers 3 days in a row without complaining." Margaret smiled despite herself. Edith Abernathy had been bringing extra food since James's funeral. "You're too kind, Edith." "Nonsense." "Oh, before I forget," Edith lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Did you hear about the commotion at the community center? Some homeless man was asking about volunteer opportunities. Mr. Peterson nearly called the police before Reverend Thomas intervened." Margaret's hand stilled on the casserole dish. "What did this man look like?" "Scruffy. Baseball cap. Jenny at the front desk said he spoke very properly, though. Educated, you know." Edith shook her head. "Such a shame. The economy these days." After Edith left, Margaret found herself driving to the community center, a canvas bag of James's old clothes on the passenger seat. She told herself she was just dropping off donations, but her eyes scanned the building's surroundings as she parked. The community center occupied what had once been the town's elementary school, a brick building with wide steps leading to double doors. Margaret climbed them slowly, her arthritis protesting the morning chill. Inside, volunteers bustled about, preparing for the food drive. Margaret recognized most of them, the benefit and curse of small-town living. Jenny Simmons waved from the reception desk. "Margaret Walsh, haven't seen you in ages. Are you here to volunteer?" "Just dropping off some items," Margaret replied. "But I heard you had an interesting visitor earlier." Jenny leaned forward. "You wouldn't believe it. This homeless guy comes in asking about the food drive, but he didn't want food. He wanted to help. Crazy, right? Mr. Peterson had a fit, but Reverend Thomas took him to the back to sort canned goods." Margaret's heart quickened. "Is he still here?" Jenny shook her head. "Left about an hour ago. Worked all morning without a break. Reverend Thomas said he was a godsend, organized the entire pantry system. Can you imagine?" Margaret couldn't quite. She left her donation and returned to her car, an unexpected disappointment weighing on her. Why was she so concerned about a man she'd met only once? As she turned onto Maple Street, she spotted a familiar figure sitting on the curb near her house. Daniel stood when he saw her car, brushing off his jeans with a self-conscious gesture. Margaret parked in the driveway and approached him cautiously. "Daniel? I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday. The community center director mentioned you lived on this street." In daylight, he looked even more out of place in his worn clothes. Something in his posture, perhaps, or the way he spoke, hinted at a different life than the one his appearance suggested. "Are you following me?" Margaret asked, only half joking. A shadow crossed his face. "I can leave if I'm making you uncomfortable." "No, Margaret paused, surprised by her own reluctance to see him go. "Would you like some tea? Or coffee?" Relief softened his features. Tea would be wonderful. They sat at her kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs, an unlikely pair brought together by coincidence, or something else, Margaret couldn't say. Daniel explained that he'd spent the morning volunteering at the community center. "They needed help organizing the pantry," he said. "It's been a while since I've done physical work. Feels good, actually. Were you in an office before?" Margaret asked carefully. Daniel's smile turned rueful. "Something like that." She didn't press. Everyone had stories they weren't ready to tell. Instead, she asked about his injury. "Bruised ribs," he admitted. "Nothing broken." "How did it happen?" "Really?" Daniel studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much truth to offer. "I was staying at a shelter in Ridgewood. Someone decided my watch was worth taking." "You were robbed?" "Attempted robbery," he corrected. "I managed to keep the watch." Margaret glanced at his wrist, bare except for a tan line where a timepiece would sit. "Where is it now?" "Pawned it this morning," he said simply. "Needed the money more than the memory." The frankness of his admission stirred something in Margaret, not pity, but recognition. Hadn't she also been forced to relinquish pieces of her former life? "Do you have somewhere to stay?" she asked. "The church opens its doors when temperatures drop below 40. Margaret looked around her empty house with its spare bedroom that hadn't housed guests in years. The words formed before she could analyze them. "You could stay here, just until you figure things out." Daniel's mug froze halfway to his lips. "Mrs. Walsh." "Margaret," she corrected. "Margaret," he amended. "That's incredibly generous, but you hardly know me. I'm a decent judge of character," she said, though in truth she couldn't explain her trust in this stranger. "And I have a baseball bat under my bed and a direct line to the sheriff, who was my husband's best friend." A smile tugged at Daniel's mouth. "Consider me warned." By evening, Daniel was settled in the guest room, freshly showered and wearing a pair of James's old sweatpants and a flannel shirt that hung loosely on his frame. Margaret had resisted the urge to ask more questions, sensing his need for privacy. As she prepared a simple dinner, she wondered what her children would say about her impulsive decision, or James for that matter. But for the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, his damp hair combed neatly back, revealing more of his face than the baseball cap had allowed. Without the scruff and shadows, he looked younger, the lines around his eyes softening. "Can I help?" he asked. They worked side by side, Daniel chopping vegetables with the precise skill of someone who had done it often, Margaret stirring the soup and sneaking glances at her unexpected houseguest. There was something about him that didn't quite add up. The calluses on his hands were recent, not the product of a lifetime of manual labor, and occasionally he used words or references that seemed out of place for someone living on the streets. "Were you a chef in your previous life?" she asked as he expertly minced garlic. His hands stilled momentarily. "No, just someone who appreciated good food." During dinner, they spoke of neutral topics: the weather, local news, the book Margaret was reading. Daniel revealed he'd been traveling through several states over the past few months. "Looking for something specific?" Margaret asked, remembering his earlier comment about finding something lost. Daniel's eyes met hers across the table. "Perspective, maybe. Or purpose." After dinner, he insisted on washing the dishes despite her protests. Margaret watched him from the doorway, this stranger who had entered her life so unexpectedly, and felt a sense of rightness she couldn't explain. Later, as she prepared for bed, she paused outside the guest room. The door was ajar, and she could see Daniel sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a photograph that must have been in his wallet. His expression, raw with grief or longing she couldn't tell which, was so private that she stepped back, unwilling to intrude further. The next morning, Margaret woke to the smell of coffee. She found Daniel in the kitchen, dressed in his own clothes, now clean and mended. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the French press, a wedding gift Margaret rarely used. "I found this in the cabinet." "Not at all." She accepted the mug he offered, noticing how the kitchen appeared tidier than it had been last night. "You didn't have to clean up." "Least I could do," he replied. "I've imposed enough." "You're not imposing," Margaret said, surprised by how much she meant it. "It's nice having someone else in the house." Daniel's expression softened. "Still, I should be moving on. I've taken up too much of your time. Where will you go?" He shrugged. "The community center needed help setting up for the food drive. Thought I'd head over there." "I was thinking of volunteering myself," Margaret said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "We could go together." The community center was transformed when they arrived. Tables lined the gymnasium, volunteers sorting donations into categories. Reverend Thomas, a slight man with perpetually smudged glasses, hurried over when he spotted them. "Daniel!" "Excellent timing. We could use your organizational skills again." He turned to Margaret with genuine pleasure. "And Margaret Walsh! What a wonderful surprise. It's been too long." For the next several hours, Margaret and Daniel worked alongside other volunteers, sorting canned goods, boxing staples, and preparing bags for distribution. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years, especially when Daniel recounted his morning struggles with what he called her temperamental coffee maker. "It's not temperamental," she protested. "It just needs to be understood." "Like most things worth having," he replied, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the cans he was labeling. By mid-afternoon, Margaret's back ached, but a pleasant sense of accomplishment had settled over her. She watched Daniel across the room, patiently explaining the sorting system to two teenage volunteers. There was an easy authority in his manner that had the boys listening attentively. During a break, Edith Abernathy cornered Margaret by the water cooler. "Who's your friend?" she asked, not bothering to lower her voice. "Just someone who needed a helping hand," Margaret replied. Edith's eyebrows rose. "Is he staying with you?" "In the guest room," Margaret said, a defensive note creeping into her voice. "He's been a perfect gentleman." "I'm sure he has," Edith said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But really, Margaret, a strange man. What would James think?" The question stung more than Margaret expected. "James would think I was finally living again," she said quietly. "Instead of just existing." She walked away before Edith could respond, blinking back unexpected tears. Because it was true, in the short time since meeting Daniel, something had shifted in her. The fog that had surrounded her since James's death seemed less dense somehow. When the day's work was finished, Margaret and Daniel walked back to her house in companionable silence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and a crisp breeze rustled the few remaining leaves on the trees. "Thank you," Daniel said suddenly. "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to be useful." Margaret glanced at him, struck by the earnestness in his voice. "You look like someone who was useful in his previous life, too." Daniel's smile held a touch of sadness. "Maybe, but not in ways that mattered." At home, Daniel insisted on cooking dinner, a simple pasta dish that somehow tasted better than anything Margaret had made for herself in months. As they ate, Margaret found herself sharing stories about James that she hadn't spoken aloud since the funeral. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Daniel said when she described how James had coached Little League despite knowing nothing about baseball. "He was." Margaret twisted her wedding ring, still present on her finger after all these years. "We had 42 years together. Sometimes I feel greedy wanting more." "It's not greedy to want love," Daniel said softly. "It's human." There was something in his tone, a personal understanding of loss, that prompted Margaret to ask, "Did you lose someone too?" Daniel was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he nodded. "My wife, Claire, 5 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, recognizing the inadequacy of the words even as she spoke them. "After she died, I threw myself into work. Told myself I was honoring her memory by building something that would last." His fingers traced patterns on the tablecloth. "All I was doing was hiding." The admission hung between them, a shared understanding that needed no further explanation. Later, as Margaret prepared for bed, she heard Daniel moving about in the guest room. 3 nights had passed since she'd offered him temporary shelter, and each evening she had expected him to announce his departure. Yet each morning he was still there, making coffee, fixing things around the house that James would have tended to, accompanying her to the community center where his quiet competence had earned everyone's respect. She knew he couldn't stay forever. Whatever he was searching for, he wouldn't find it in her spare bedroom. But for now, his presence filled a void she hadn't fully acknowledged. The following day brought an unexpected complication in the form of Jennifer's phone call. "Surprise!" her daughter announced. "I've taken a few days off work. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon." Margaret's heart sank. "Tomorrow? That's wonderful, dear, but I wish you'd given me more notice. I wanted to surprise you. Is everything okay?" "Of course," Margaret said quickly. "It's just, I have a house guest at the moment." A pause. "A house guest?" Margaret explained about Daniel as briefly as possible, emphasizing his volunteer work and downplaying the circumstances of their meeting. "Mom," Jennifer's voice had taken on the patient tone she used when she thought her mother was being naive. "You let a homeless man stay in our house? Have you lost your mind?" "He's not just a homeless man," Margaret protested. "And it's my house now, Jennifer? I'm calling Michael. We'll both come." "Clearly you need—" "What I need," Margaret interrupted with uncharacteristic firmness, "is for my children to trust my judgment. Daniel has been nothing but respectful and helpful. I'm not senile or desperate for company. I'm helping someone who needed it, just like your father would have done." The silence that followed was so lengthy that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Jennifer sighed. "Fine, but I'm still coming tomorrow, and Michael will be there on Saturday." After hanging up, Margaret found Daniel on the back porch, reading a book he'd borrowed from her shelf, a biography of Roosevelt that had been James's. "My daughter's visiting tomorrow," she said without preamble, "and my son on Saturday." Daniel closed the book. "I should leave then. I don't want to complicate things for you." The thought of him leaving created an unexpected pang. "You don't have to go. It's just, they're concerned about you staying here." "As they should be," he said with a wry smile. "Their mother took in a stranger. Not exactly conventional behavior. Nothing about my life has felt conventional since James died," Margaret admitted, sitting in the chair beside him. "But having you here, working at the center, it's the first time I've felt like myself in years." Daniel's expression softened. "Then I'm grateful our paths crossed, Margaret Walsh." The next day, Daniel was gone before Margaret woke, a note on the kitchen counter explaining he'd gone to the community center early. Preparing the guest room for Jennifer, Margaret noticed he had stripped the bed and neatly folded the borrowed clothes at the foot. Her daughter arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, her sleek car looking out of place in the driveway of the modest bungalow. Jennifer Walsh Chen had inherited her father's height and her mother's determination, wrapped in the polished exterior of a successful marketing executive. "Mom!" she exclaimed, wrapping Margaret in a tight hug that smelled of expensive perfume. "You look good. Better than last time." Margaret returned the embrace, genuinely happy to see her daughter despite the circumstances. "It's the fresh air. I've been volunteering at the community center." Jennifer's smile turned knowing. "With your house guest?" "Among others." Margaret led her inside. "Daniel's been a tremendous help there. Reverend Thomas says he's revolutionized their inventory system." Jennifer set her designer luggage in the hallway. And where is this paragon of organizational virtue? At the center now, I expect. He left early this morning. Jennifer's relief was palpable. Good. That gives us time to talk. She took Margaret's hand, leading her to the couch. Mom, I know you're lonely. We all miss Dad. But taking in strangers isn't the answer. Margaret withdrew her hand. I didn't take him in because I'm lonely, Jennifer. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And how do you know he isn't taking advantage of your kindness? People can be very manipulative when they want something. What exactly would he be after? Margaret asked. I'm not wealthy. The house is my only real asset, and he's shown zero interest in my financials. Jennifer sighed. I'm just worried about you. Living alone, letting your guard down with someone you barely know. I'm 67, not 97, Margaret said firmly. And Daniel has given me no reason to distrust him. Quite the opposite. They were still discussing it when the doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find Daniel standing there, looking more put together than she'd yet seen him. He'd gotten a haircut, his face was cleanly shaved, and he wore new jeans and a simple button-down shirt, likely purchased with the money from his pawned watch. I thought I should make myself scarce while your daughter visits, he said. Just came to collect my things. Before Margaret could respond, Jennifer appeared behind her. You must be Daniel. If Daniel was intimidated by Jennifer's scrutinizing gaze, he didn't show it. Ms. Walsh, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your mother has been incredibly kind to me. So I've heard. Jennifer's tone was cool, assessing. She says you've been volunteering at the community center. Yes. Food distribution mainly. Though today I was helping with their after-school program. Some of the kids needed homework help. Something in Jennifer's expression shifted slightly. What subject? Math. Algebra specifically. Not everyone's favorite, but important. Jennifer glanced at Margaret, then back to Daniel. You teach math? In another life? He said with a small smile. Now I just try to be useful where I can. Margaret could almost see her daughter's mind working, reassessing her assumptions. Jennifer had always been analytical. Even as a child, she'd needed to categorize and understand everything. Why don't you come in? Margaret suggested. I was about to make lunch. Daniel hesitated. I don't want to intrude on your family time. Nonsense. Jennifer wants to get to know you, don't you, dear? Jennifer's smile was diplomatic. Of course. Over sandwiches, Jennifer subtly interrogated Daniel about his background. Margaret noted how carefully he answered, never lying outright but deflecting certain questions with practiced ease. Yes, he had been married. No children. He'd worked in finance before his current situation, had traveled extensively for business. And what brings you to Whispering Pines? Jennifer asked. It's hardly a hub for the financially distressed. Daniel set down his water glass. Sometimes you find yourself in unexpected places when you're looking for answers. What kind of answers? The kind that tell you who you really are when everything else is stripped away. His gaze shifted to Margaret. Sometimes it takes a stranger's kindness to help you see clearly. Jennifer looked between them, her expression unreadable. After lunch, she insisted on helping Margaret with the dishes, while Daniel excused himself to the porch with a book. He's not what I expected, Jennifer admitted quietly. What did you expect? Someone rougher, less educated. He speaks like... She frowned, searching for the right comparison. Like someone who had a different life before. Margaret supplied. I've noticed. Aren't you curious about his story? The real one? Margaret dried a plate slowly. Of course I am. But everyone has the right to share their past in their own time. Or not at all. Jennifer shook her head. You're too trusting, Mom. Maybe, Margaret conceded. Or maybe trust is exactly what some people need to find their way back. That evening, the three of them watched an old movie on TV, the kind of classic film James had loved. Daniel and Jennifer discovered a shared appreciation for vintage cinema, which thawed the atmosphere considerably. When Jennifer finally retired to the guest room, her parting glance at Margaret held less worry than before. Daniel had made a pallet on the couch, refusing Margaret's offer to sleep in her sewing room. Your son is coming tomorrow, he reminded her. This is temporary, remember? But the word temporary hung between them, suddenly heavy with unspoken questions. In the morning, Margaret found Jennifer and Daniel in deep conversation at the kitchen table, laptops open between them. Morning, Mom, Jennifer said brightly. Daniel's been helping me with a work problem. Did you know he understands market analytics? Daniel closed the laptop with a self-deprecating smile. Just offering a perspective. Jennifer has everything well in hand. Margaret poured herself coffee, watching this unexpected alliance with wry amusement. By the time Michael arrived that afternoon, earlier than expected and with a carefully neutral expression, Jennifer had shifted from suspicious to cautiously accepting of their houseguest. Michael Walsh was his father's son in every way that mattered: practical, direct, and protective of his mother. His handshake with Daniel was firm to the point of challenging. "So," he said without preamble, "how long have you been staying here?" "Almost a week," Daniel replied evenly. "Your mother has been very generous." "She tends to be that," Michael said, his tone making it clear he didn't necessarily consider it a virtue in this case. The afternoon progressed with Michael watching Daniel's every move, asking pointed questions about his background that Daniel deflected with the same careful ambiguity he'd shown Jennifer. But when Daniel offered to grill the steaks Michael had brought, revealing an expertise with the Weber that even James had never mastered, Michael's suspicion acquired a hint of reluctant respect. After dinner, Margaret found herself alone in the kitchen with both her children, while Daniel tactfully offered to check something on the grill. "Well?" she asked, facing them squarely. "Have you decided I'm not being taken advantage of?" Michael and Jennifer exchanged glances. "He's not what I expected," Michael admitted. "That's what I said," Jennifer agreed. "But Mom, something doesn't add up. His knowledge base, his mannerisms, they don't match his circumstances. People end up homeless for all sorts of reasons," Margaret pointed out, "not just the ones you see in movies." "Still," Michael persisted, "don't you want to know who he really is?" Margaret considered the question. Did she want to know? Or was there something comforting in the unspoken boundaries they'd established, the way they'd connected without the complications of complete disclosure? "I know enough," she said finally. "He's someone who needed help and has given back tenfold. The rest is his to share when he's ready." Later that night, after her children had gone to bed, Margaret found Daniel sitting on the back porch steps, looking up at the stars. She joined him, wrapping her cardigan tightly against the evening chill. "They're good people, your children," Daniel said softly. "They love you very much." "They're overprotective," Margaret replied. "But yes, they're good people." Silence settled between them, comfortable and undemanding. The neighborhood was quiet, most windows dark, the distant sound of a train whistled the only interruption. "I should leave tomorrow," Daniel said eventually. "I've imposed on your family long enough." Margaret's protest rose immediately. "You don't have to go. Jennifer and Michael will understand. It's not just about them." Daniel turned to face her, his expression solemn in the dim porch light. "Margaret, you've shown me more kindness than I deserve. You've reminded me what it means to be part of something, to contribute. But I need to resolve some things on my own." "What things?" He hesitated, then reached for his wallet and carefully extracted a photograph, handing it to her. In the light spilling from the kitchen window, Margaret could make out a smiling couple, a younger Daniel with his arm around a beautiful woman with curly dark hair. "Claire," Margaret guessed. "Yes," Daniel's voice held a wealth of emotion. "She died believing I'd become someone I'm not sure I recognize anymore." "What do you mean?" He took the photo back, handling it like something precious. "I told you I worked in finance. What I didn't say was that I built a company that, well, it made me very wealthy. After Claire died, I threw myself into work, expanded, acquired competitors, became known for being ruthless in business." Margaret studied his profile, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man who had so patiently taught algebra to struggling children. "3 months ago, I overheard my board members talking about me," Daniel continued. "They called me the machine, said I'd lost whatever humanity I once had." His laugh held no humor. "That night, I looked at this photo of Claire and realized she wouldn't recognize the man I'd become either." "So you walked away?" Margaret said, understanding dawning. "From everything," Daniel nodded. "Left my phone, my credit cards, took some cash and the clothes I was wearing. Needed to remember what it felt like to be just human, not defined by wealth or power." "And have you remembered?" His eyes met hers, warm with genuine feeling. "Thanks to you, I'm starting to—" The revelation should have shocked her more, Margaret thought, learning that the man sleeping on her couch was actually wealthy enough to buy her entire street. But somehow, it made a strange kind of sense. The incongruities she'd noticed, the skills that seemed at odds with his apparent circumstances. "What will you do now?" she asked. Daniel looked back at the stars. "I need to face what I left behind, make some changes. Try to run my company the way Claire would have wanted, with compassion and purpose, not just profit." Margaret felt an unexpected hollowness at the thought of him returning to his real life, a life that had no place for a widow from a small town. "The community center will miss you," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Reverend Thomas says you've transformed their operation." "I've already spoken with him about a substantial anonymous donation," Daniel replied with a small smile. "Enough to upgrade their facilities and expand their programs." "Of course you have," Margaret said, warmth spreading through her chest. Even with his impending departure, he was thinking of others. The next morning, Margaret woke to find Michael and Jennifer in intense conversation at the kitchen table, a laptop open between them. "What's going on?" she asked, noticing Daniel's absence. Jennifer looked up, her expression a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "Mom, do you have any idea who Daniel really is?" Margaret's stomach tightened. "He told me some of it last night." "Some of it?" Michael turned the laptop toward her. "Mom, he's Daniel Harrington, founder and CEO of Harrington Global Investments. Forbes listed his net worth at over $4 billion last year." On the screen was a professional photograph of Daniel in an impeccable suit, looking confident and commanding, so different from the gentleman who had washed her dishes and fixed her leaky faucet. "Where is he?" Margaret asked, looking around as if he might materialize from behind the refrigerator. "He left about an hour ago," Jennifer said. "Said he had some calls to make." "Mom, do you realize what this means? You've had one of the richest men in America sleeping on your couch." Margaret sank into a chair, trying to process this additional information. Billionaire. The word seemed impossibly remote from the Daniel she knew. "There's more," Michael said, scrolling down the page. "According to this, he disappeared 3 months ago. His company reported him taking a sabbatical for personal reasons, but there are rumors he had some kind of breakdown after a board meeting. No one knew where he was. Until Mom found him in the park," Jennifer finished, her voice tinged with awe. Margaret looked between her children, seeing the calculations running behind their eyes. "This doesn't change anything," she said firmly. "Are you kidding?" Michael exclaimed. "It changes everything. Mom, he could set you up for life, buy you a new house, pay for the best retirement community, anything you want." "That's not why I helped him," Margaret said, a flush of indignation warming her cheeks. "Of course not," Jennifer said quickly. "But surely he'll want to repay your kindness." Before Margaret could respond, the front door opened, and Daniel Harrington, billionaire, stepped into the kitchen. One look at their faces told him everything. "Ah," he said, his smile rueful. "I see Google has revealed my secrets. Why didn't you tell us?" Jennifer asked. "Would it have mattered?" Daniel countered gently. "Would you have believed a supposed billionaire was sleeping on park benches by choice?" Michael shook his head slowly. "Probably not." Daniel turned to Margaret, his expression softening. "I was going to tell you everything before I left. I've made arrangements to return to my company. My assistant is sending a car this afternoon." Margaret nodded, unable to find words past the tightness in her throat. This was always temporary, she reminded herself. A brief intersection of lives that were never meant to fully merge. Jennifer and Michael excused themselves with transparent excuses about packing, leaving Margaret alone with Daniel in the kitchen. "I want to thank you, Margaret," he said when they'd gone. "What you did for me? It wasn't just opening your home. You helped me remember who I was before grief and ambition changed me." "I didn't do anything special," Margaret protested. "Anyone would have—" "No," Daniel interrupted gently. "Not anyone. Most people walked past. You saw someone in need and extended your hand. Simple human kindness. The thing I'd forgotten was still possible." Margaret blinked back sudden tears. "Will you go back to being the machine?" Daniel's laugh was genuine. "No. That chapter is closed. Claire would have hated that version of me." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said about the community center, how being there made you feel useful again after James died." "It did," Margaret confirmed. "Having a purpose beyond my own grief. It helps. That's why I've decided to establish a foundation in Claire's name, focused on community revitalization in small towns like this one." His eyes met hers. "I'd like you to be part of it, Margaret. Your insight, your compassion, they're exactly what it needs." Margaret stared at him, trying to absorb the offer. "I don't know anything about running foundations. You know what matters. Seeing the need behind the facade, understanding that sometimes people just need someone to believe in them." He smiled. "The rest is just paperwork, and I have people for that." The possibility unfurled before her, a new chapter she hadn't anticipated. Not charity from a grateful billionaire, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "I'd need to think about it," she said carefully. "This is my home. My memories of James are here." "Of course," Daniel said. "And the foundation would be based in Whispering Pines. I've already looked into property. The old mill building would make an excellent headquarters once renovated." Margaret's breath caught. He had thought of everything, eliminating obstacles before she could raise them. "You're very persuasive, Mr. Harrington." "I've been told it's one of my better qualities," he replied with a grin that made him look younger, more like the man in the photograph with Claire. When Daniel's car arrived, a sleek black sedan with a discreet driver, Michael and Jennifer watched in poorly concealed fascination as a uniformed man loaded Daniel's meager belongings into the trunk. Daniel shook Michael's hand, accepted Jennifer's somewhat awkward hug, and then turned to Margaret. "The foundation proposal will be emailed to you tomorrow," he said. "No pressure. Whatever you decide, your friendship has been invaluable." Margaret nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This tall, accomplished man who could buy and sell her town a dozen times over had slept on her couch, fixed her gutters, and somehow helped mend something broken inside her. "Thank you," she managed finally, "for letting me help." Daniel's smile held understanding. "That's the real gift, isn't it? Being allowed to help others." "You taught me that." He embraced her briefly, then stepped back with a nod that somehow conveyed everything words couldn't. As the car pulled away, Margaret felt Jennifer's arm slide around her shoulders. "Mom, do you realize what just happened?" her daughter asked, voice hushed with awe. "A billionaire wants you to run his foundation." Margaret smiled, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. "No, dear. A lonely man found his way back by connecting with others. The money is incidental." Michael snorted. $4 billion is hardly incidental, Mom." "You'd be surprised?" Margaret said softly. "What truly matters when you've lost everything that gave your life meaning." 2 months later, Margaret stood in the renovated mill building, sunlight streaming through the newly installed windows. The space hummed with activity, contractors finalizing details, staff setting up workstations, community representatives touring the facilities. The Claire Harrington Community Foundation had moved from concept to reality with breathtaking speed, fueled by Daniel's resources and Margaret's steady guidance. The foundation's mission, to revitalize small communities through targeted investment in social services, education, and local businesses, had already attracted national attention. "Mrs. Walsh?" A young assistant appeared at her elbow. "Mr. Harrington's video call is ready in the conference room." Margaret nodded, smoothing her new blouse, one of several Jennifer had insisted on buying her when the foundation appointment became official. "Thank you, Taylor." In the sleek conference room, Daniel's face filled the large screen, his expression brightening when he saw her. "Margaret, how goes the battle?" "The community center's after-school program is fully funded," she reported. "And we've approved the first round of small business grants." Reverend Thomas is beside himself with excitement about the new roof. Daniel chuckled. "Excellent. And how are you settling in? Not too overwhelming?" Margaret considered the question. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of activity, meetings, decisions, learning the complexities of foundation management. But underlying the busy days was a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since James's diagnosis. "I'm finding my feet," she said. "Though I think Taylor despairs of my filing system." "Taylor can adapt," Daniel replied firmly. "Your intuition about where resources should go is worth more than perfect paperwork." They discussed foundation business for several minutes before Daniel's expression turned more personal. "I'll be there next week for the official opening," he said. "The board meetings can be handled remotely, but I want to be present for this milestone." Margaret nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anticipation at seeing him again. Their friendship had continued through daily calls and video conferences, evolving into a partnership that balanced his business acumen with her community insight. "The guest room is ready whenever you want it," she said. "Though I imagine you'd prefer the hotel." Daniel's smile was warm. "Actually, I was hoping the offer of your guest room was still open. Hotels are lonely." The simple admission, from a man who could purchase any accommodation he desired, touched Margaret deeply. "Of course it's open. Always." After the call ended, Margaret walked through the foundation offices, greeting staff members and contractors. The building that had once manufactured textiles now hummed with a different kind of productivity, people working together to strengthen the community fabric in more metaphorical ways. Outside, Margaret paused on the steps, looking across the town square to where the community center stood. A group of children played on the new equipment in the yard, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Two seniors from the day program waved at her from a bench, and Margaret waved back, reminded of how isolated she'd been just months ago. Now her days overflowed with purpose and connection. That evening, as she watered the flower beds James had lovingly tended, Margaret reflected on the strange path that had led her here. A chance encounter in the park, a simple act of kindness, a lonely widow who helped a stranger in need, never realizing he was a billionaire in disguise. But the disguise, she now understood, had revealed the truth rather than concealed it. Daniel had needed to strip away the trappings of wealth and power to remember who he truly was, and in helping him find his way back, Margaret had found her own path forward. The phone rang inside and Margaret smiled, knowing without checking that it would be Daniel, calling as he did each evening to share the day's events. Their lives, so different yet linked by shared loss and tentative renewal, had become interwoven in ways neither could have predicted. As she turned toward the house, Margaret felt James's presence, not as a ghost or memory, but as the foundation that had shaped her capacity for compassion. He would have approved of this new chapter, she thought, would have recognized in Daniel a kindred spirit who understood that wealth meant nothing without purpose. And purpose, Margaret had discovered, often began with the simplest act, seeing someone in need and extending a hand.